So what we want to do tonight, and the whole purpose of this, is to just share some information about environmental justice. Because one of the things that we know is that people think that it is something that doesn't affect them. What we hope you will hear tonight, either through the questions that our moderators ask or through the questions that our students ask, you will hear something and learn a bit about environmental justice. I want to thank the president of this university, President James Clark. I want to thank all of the folk who have been engaged and involved in this. And I want to point out to you that we've got a row of students here who are engaged, who have read the platform, and who will be asking questions. Let's give our students a big round of applause. The other thing I'd like to share with you just very briefly is how we got here. Back in January, NBCSL met in South Carolina, and we met with a group of frontline activists, people who are on the ground working on this issue. We talked a lot about how we can partner, how we can collaborate with each other. And because NBCSL is very much interested in collaborations and systemic changes, we thought it important for us to work with grassroots organizations on one hand, but on the other hand, to let them know that state legislators and local county commissioners are options that they ought to consider. Long story short, they were very much interested in having presidential candidates respond to the issues that were important to them. They started work in January all through the spring and came up with an environmental justice platform. Here tonight, both from the students as well as the moderators, for the most part, came from that platform. And so we are real interested in hearing the candidates' position. We thank them, and you're going to hear a lot of thanking of the candidates who did choose to come and share their views with us. At this point, we're going to ask that since I couldn't get the drum line to come back, I guess they were like, nah, chicken drumettes are not enough for me to come back up here when I've been up here all this time. So at this point, what I'd like to do is ask if we could please stand and pledge allegiance to the flag, if you would. May we all stand? Yes. Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. At this time, I would like to introduce our moderators who will be with us. We are going live, so you might want to text whoever you know and tell them to watch it live streaming. We are pleased to have Democracy Now! As our host for this event. We are extremely pleased to have this event being live streamed. We are joined tonight. You ready?
Sorry to introduce. We have 14 seconds to open.
Okay, and we're going to turn it over to them for the next 12
You're going to
seconds.
see a live broadcast, folks. Okay, here we go. Those presidential candidates who accepted will be speaking tonight in order: Tom Steyer, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker, John Delaney, Joe Sestak, and Marianne Williamson. But first, we're going to hear from the president of the university and environmental justice activists from around the country. But before we go to them, I want to ask my co-moderator, Mustafa Ali, what does environmental justice mean to you? You've been an activist in this area for decades. Environmental justice and environmental racism.
Environmental justice is the disproportionate impacts that continue to happen in our communities. The things that no one else wants, they place them in communities of color, low-income communities, and indigenous lands. They become the sacrifice zones for coal-fired power plants, for certified animal feeding operations, for waste treatment facilities, for unhealthy housing, where we find lead and so many other impacts that are happening. So, in essence, the environmental injustices that continue to happen are happening to people of color and low-income communities.
And these are the issues we're going to explore tonight with 6 presidential candidates. But before we do, I want to introduce our host for tonight, Representative Gilda Cobb-Hunter. She's president of the NBCSL, that's the National Black Caucus of State Legislators. She's the first African-American woman to represent Orangeburg in the South Carolina legislature. Representative Cobb-Hunter, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Amy. Thank you so much. Okay, guys, that's enough. Y'all gonna make me think I'm special. You've heard enough from me. Just welcome and thanks for being here. I want to introduce the president of this fine institution to bring greetings and welcome you to Bulldog Country. Please join me in welcoming the president of South Carolina State University, Mr. James Clark. President.
Good afternoon. Once again, good afternoon. Welcome to the 2019 Presidential Forum. State of South Carolina, and is the state's only publicly supported HBCU. You're at an institution that develops leaders. Leaders in politics, as exemplified by our loyal son and majority whip, Congressman James G. Clyburn. Leaders in engineering, and as exemplified by the South Carolina State having the state's only undergraduate nuclear engineering program amongst its many wonderful engineering offerings. Leaders in science, as exemplified by our joint initiative with MUSC and cancer research, focused especially on the disparities found amongst African American males in this region. Leaders in athletics, as exemplified by the fact that until very recently, South Carolina State was the only institution in the state with anyone in the NFL Hall of Fame, the NFL Football Hall of Fame. And we had not one, not two, but 3. Leaders in education, as exemplified by the fact that a significant portion of the educators in this state, be they teachers, principals, or superintendents, got their degrees right here on these very grounds. Grounds where one can go from 3 to PhD in education right in one location. Leaders in the military, as exemplified by the fact that only West Point has produced more African American generals or flag officers, with 26, and we're at 22 and gaining on West Point. This proud institution has a legacy of having an understanding of, and being responsive to the needs, concerns, and the issues of its community. So it is only proper that this forum, and that a forum on environmental justice, something that affects us all, but our communities disproportionately, is being held on the grounds of this great institution. So again, I say, welcome to South Carolina State University, and welcome to the 2019 Presidential Forum on Environmental Justice. Thank you.
Very bring our candidates. We thought it important that you hear from people who are actually on the ground working on this issue, not just talking about it. We are pleased to bring you 5 activists, frontline community workers, who are going to take 2 minutes each to share their stories. They will appear in this order: Harold Mitchell, Regenesis in Spartanburg; Richard Moore, Las Harris Institute; Sophia Martinez, Concerned Citizens of Wagon Mound; Dr. Mildred McLean, Harambee; and Michelle Roberts, Environmental Justice Health Alliance. And we're going to ask all of them to come in that order, please. Mr. Mitchell.
In 1991 in Washington, D.C., where over 1,000 of us came together and redefined environmentalism and conservationism as where we work, where we live, where we play, where we pray, and where we go to school or where we learn. I think additionally, coming out of that and redefining environmentalism, then based upon that, the principles of environmental justice were established in Washington, D.C. And so out of that convening then, as we say then, environmental and economic justice as a relationship to climate change, the issues that are being impacted in our communities were re-put back on the table. So there's a lot of history there. In New Mexico, we're faced with many of the same situations and the issues that we visited here in South Carolina on several of our trips, and so on. I would just highly encourage you, lastly, those that are here that don't understand our history and the connection between civil rights and environmental and economic justice and the intersection of environmental racism and environmental genocide, the intentional targeting of communities of color, Native Indigenous communities, and others for anything that others do not want in their community. So I thank you very much for allowing us the opportunity to speak with you this evening, and we're looking forward to the forum. Thank you very much.
Good evening. My name is Sofia Martinez. I'm from White Mountain, New Mexico, although I also live in Albuquerque. I want to thank the folks that worked on organizing this environmental justice forum for the presidential candidates tonight. And I also want to thank those presidential candidates that showed up. Environmental justice is about justice. It is a paradigm shift of environmentalism. Environmental justice is, hold a minute here. Environmental justice is not merely the places that we preserve, conserve, and go to recreate. It is where we live, play, pray, and go to school. It is this definition that was developed by a collective of racially, economically, gender, and sexually diverse grassroots peoples that launched the EJ movement. Environmental justice is place-based health impacts, it is climate justice, it is economic justice, it is reproductive justice. It is about continuing our struggle for all poor and people of color. New Mexico, a rural state that has continued to be the neo-colony of the United States regardless of who is in power. Our natural resources have been and continue to be used as the cheap supply of raw materials, weapons development, and cheap labor. And we have the Superfund sites and the health issues to prove it. We are host to Los Alamos and Sandia Labs, second only to Livermore Labs in California in terms of military weapons development, including weapons of mass destruction. Weapons that have poisoned indigenous nations on the uranium belt of New Mexico. Weapons that only the United States has dropped on human populations. Weapons that have poisoned the population of New Mexico with newborn babies showing toxins from the nuclear chain. Weapons, hazardous waste that is taken back to New Mexico, the only hazardous dump in this country. The Waste Isolation Project, or WIP. We continue to be one of the poorest states in the nation. People of color, indigenous folks, and the very county that I am from are in competition with predominantly black states, which is the poorest. The lesson here is that we need to come together as poor, indigenous, and people of color to challenge our continuing minimum wage labor and support not only the 1%, that supports not only the 1%, but that liberal 25% that with the 1% consumes 75 to 80% of the world's resources. We must demand protection of natural resources, a free, non-racist education, forgiveness of student loans, a livable minimum wage that recognizes those that have built this country. It is not Facebook, Google, or the liberals that come to our state and our communities to protect and help us. You must stop building your reputations, resumes, and careers on our poverty and contamination. We will not let your new Green Deal be just the same old deal.
Today, as I speak, a nuclear summit is taking place in New Mexico. Activists from the United States, Japan, and other countries will come together tonight to build power to challenge liberal contentions that nuclear is clean. It is as dirty as the politics we see on television each day from the White House. And unlike the rollback of environmental protections that will plague us for decades, hazardous waste will haunt us for hundreds of years, just as climate change will eliminate life as we know it. In 1972, polluting facilities paid for research to identify where might be the easiest place to site polluting facilities. The result, the Sorrell report, suggested regions that were poor, with little education, rural, little news circulation, bilingual, and Catholic, among other characteristics. This is why we, as poor, white, and people of color, must come together to continue this type of forum and to continue to challenge our marginalization by some politicians. We also know that they are not all white. Workers unite, we shall overcome.
We are sick and tired of being sick and tired. But most of all, we are sick of dying from being exposed to pollutants that come out of
factories and manufacturers who care nothing about us as people, they only care about profits. We are victims of environmental racism, and we demand environmental reparations. We are community people, we are families. We are sisters and brothers, we are aunts and uncles who are concerned about our children's future. We are sick and tired of being sick and tired has been the battle cry of the environmental justice communities from the time that we started, and it should always be until we establish policies that will promote justice and equity and will eliminate inequities in our health system. Our health is our wealth. And without health, what can you do? We call upon all of our young people, our elders, our children, our academicians, our scholars, our researchers, our scientists, our mothers and fathers to join hands in the name of our organization, which is Harambe. Harambe means let's pull together. And without pulling together, we will not be able to dismantle this machine that keeps moving and moving and moving in denial that there is environmental injustice. So tonight, as the candidates come before you, our question becomes, how will each of you, if elected, engage you, the public, engage the impacted communities, engage the front line and the fence line communities, and those community-based organizations who have for the last 30 years worked on an environmental, equity, and just platform that addresses, indeed, climate justice. I woke up one morning in 1991, and the headlines in the Savannah Morning News was 20,000 picocuries of tritium leaked from the Savannah River site, which is located in Aiken, South Carolina. But the water tributaries in the Savannah River in my neighborhood, in the plantation where I live, where a small community of 300 or 400 people are right at the mouth of the river, and they're right in a donut of 17 polluting industries. These are moms and pops who go to work every day. So environmental justice addresses a myriad of issues. But I don't want you to forget that nuclear weapons facility right here in South Carolina, because it is a part of a national complex that is run by the Department of Energy. Through our work, we were able to help the department develop an environmental justice program, but that's not enough. That's not enough. What's going to be required of us is that for everyone who's sitting in this audience to become an activist, an advocate, and a mover and a shaker. A mover and a shaker to shake up what already is, to replace a new vision, a new agenda that looks at all of us as creations of the Creator. And as such, we have a human right to clean air, clean water, clean land, and healthy bodies. So I challenge each one of you, and those of you who are looking and listening and recording, to go out and bring somebody else into the environmental justice movement. Remember, environmental justice is climate justice. Climate justice is environmental justice. And one day we want to say, in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King, free at last, Thank God Almighty, Mother Earth is free at last. Thank you.
So that's Mildred McLean, co-founder and currently serving as the executive director of the Harambee House, Citizens for Environmental Justice. That's right, people on the front lines of the climate crisis today from all over the country.
Coordinator for the Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform. I want to thank you, South Carolina, NBCSL, and all others who put significant work into this process. I am a proud graduate of an HBCU, Morgan State University. And at Morgan State University, I became a trained scientist. You know, there's no blacks in science, but HBCUs produce the best and the brightest. The Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform is a collective of what we call legacy fence line, frontline groups. You know the ones, people concerned about chemical safety. Mossville, Louisiana. Wilmington, Delaware, Delaware Concerned Residents for Environmental Justice, where I am originally from. Las Jardines Institute, who you heard, and many more. Our communities, and let me not forget West County Toxics, Dr. Henry Clark, Alaska Community Action Against Toxics. Our communities are legacy communities that have been harmed by centuries of racism, colonization, and economic injustice and exploitation. We are part of the change that we hold the solutions that are necessary to make effective change in this country. The Environmental Justice Health Alliance for Chemical Policy Reform, EJHA as we call ourselves. We provide the capacity support for our communities, from that of building capacity to that of supporting with technical assistance and the solutions that's necessary to make effective change in this country. And as a result, as you heard all of the other speakers before me, we are sick and tired of being hurt, sick, dying. I just left my father's hospital room from early this morning where he, Leslie R. Robertson, thanks be to God, is better this week. But my father said we must stand against this racism. And so as a result, as you heard Richard Moore, in 1991, the first People of Color Summit brought thousands of people to Washington, D.C. and redefined environmentalism and conservationism. Well, we're proud to say 28 years later, we took the national groups to task. National groups that included environmental and advocacy, legal advocacy groups. And now we have created what's called the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform. The necessary point of that is that we must go beyond that of the carbon-centric, market-based conversations that we've been so consumed in that will not take care of our people. We must be about addressing cumulative impact. Mandatory emissions reductions, not that just of the carbon-centric conversation that we are caught up in. We are asking our brilliant students here to be part of this process and to help us move this initiative. It is high time that we take the principled integrity and solutions that our communities have been asking for over and over and over and over again. You see the 17 principles in the environmental justice principles. Our vision for a just climate future includes a healthy climate, air quality for all, access to reliable, affordable, and sustainability, electricity, water, and transportation for every community, an inclusive, just, and pollution-free energy economy with high-quality jobs, safe, healthy communities, and infrastructure. And guess who should be at the front of that line? Our communities. Enough is enough. It is time for a change. We are standing here for an equitable and just climate future for all, where no community is left behind. We thank everyone who showed up, and for those who didn't, catch up. Because now is the time for us to change this narrative. It is time. It is time. It is time. Will you join us? Thank you very much, South Carolina. Right on and to the people. Let's give all our frontline activists a big round of applause. And I hope you hear, after you've heard them, I hope you understand why we thought it important that you hear from them. More importantly, we want you to remember the challenge that Dr. McClain gave to all of us. At this time, I will introduce to you our two moderators for tonight. They, in turn, will introduce our candidates. We are pleased that we have 6 candidates who will be joining us tonight. Our moderators are Amy Goodman with Democracy Now! And Mustafa Santiago Ali with the National Wildlife Federation. Give them
who have agreed to attend tonight's first ever presidential forum on environmental justice are Tom Steyer, Senators Elizabeth Warren and Cory Booker, John Delaney, Joe Sistak, and Marianne Williamson. We begin with 3 minutes of a public statement by Tom Steyer.
Environmental justice is not an afterthought at all for me. It is absolutely central to what I'm doing. I have said that climate is the #1 priority of my presidency, and that I'll declare a state of emergency on day 1. But that climate plan is described as a justice-based climate plan, and environmental justice is the planning process used in order to make sure that it's just and that the communities where pollution has been concentrated will be in the lead in terms of policy and execution. I think a lot of the people who are going to follow me here at this podium are going to talk to you about what they're going to do. But I want to tell you what I've done over the last decade. I led the fight for clean energy in California, and the reason we won was because environmental justice was at the heart. That fight has put together the biggest pot of money to redress frontline communities where pollution, air pollution and water pollution have been centered. $1.5 billion has already been spent. There's $3 billion more in the pot to redress that, and it will continue. I've also led the fight for clean energy outside California, in Nevada, in Michigan, in Arizona, and always environmental justice has been at the center. I worked with the activists in Oxnard to stop the last fossil fuel plant I hope is ever proposed for California, which they were going to put in a low-income Latino community where they already had a series of toxic plants and where they thought they could get away with it. And I've worked with activists around this country. I've gone to Flint, Michigan. I've been to Fresno, California. I've been to East Porterville, where you can't drink the water. I've just come today from Denmark, South Carolina. It's not my first trip to Denmark. I know what the water situation there is, and I also know that it's going to be much broader than people know. You can't do climate, you can't do the environment, you can't do pollution unless you have environmental justice at its core. Environmental justice is just another word for saying racism. They've chosen to concentrate air and water pollution in Black and brown communities, and specifically African American communities. So if we're going to repair that injustice, we're going to have to do it deliberately in terms of clean air, clean waters, And as we rebuild this country in a sustainable way, the people from those communities have to be in the front of the line for the millions of good jobs that we're going to create. And I want to finish on a hopeful note. The best environmental justice project I've ever seen in the United States is in South Carolina. It's in Spartanburg. It's the Regenesis Project. It's fantastic. I know Mustafa's worked on it, started by a fantastic, brilliant man named Harold Mitchell from South Carolina.
Tom, welcome.
Mustafa, nice to see you.
It's good to see you too.
That this country has focused its air pollution and its water pollution in communities of color. And I think that if you look around, you can look at South Carolina, you can look at every part of this country, and I think it's just the tip of the iceberg that we know right now. Yes, I know what's happened in Denmark. I've talked to the activists there and worked with them. But I can tell you, I think we're going to see that across South Carolina. I think it's going to be based on race. I know if you go to Flint, Michigan, ask who lives there. If you go to Newark, ask who lives there. Go to East Porterville, go to Fresno. West Fresno has a 15-year lower life expectancy than North Fresno that's 2 miles away. It's based on pollution of every kind you can think of. So when I look around the United States of America, I know that the politics have concentrated the dangerous health of pollution in the communities of color, specifically African Americans.
So let's go a little bit deeper. Environmental racism is the new Jim Crow. In regards to food, housing, jobs, education, what is your plan to address environmental racism?
Well, we are going to, look, this is my number one priority, is to rebuild this country. Environmental justice in the lead. So that means as we rebuild this country, whether that's the $90 billion that we're going to spend on residential water, whether that's the $700 billion that we're going to spend on the grid, whether it's rebuilding the roads or the public transit systems, I am going to make sure that the planning process starts in the communities, and they start with the leaders from communities like Denmark, South Carolina, to make sure that as we do this, we redress the air and water problems specifically, and that the jobs go to those communities first. So when I think about this redressing, it's everything. I mean, Mustafa, you asked a question that suggested, is it just air and water pollution? No, it goes far beyond that. And I believe we can rebuild this country spiritually as well as physically by undoing this injustice and this racism, specifically through a gigantic program of rebirth.
Entering the race, Michael Bloomberg. It's not clear if one of the candidates, President Trump, is one himself. But you, at this point, are the only billionaire in the Democratic primary. The issue of environmental justice and economic equity. The Climate Accountability Institute did a study saying the world's wealthiest corporations are most responsible for the climate crisis. And of course, the communities of color, indigenous communities, are most impacted by that crisis. The Climate Accountability Institute says more than 70% of global emissions come from just 100 companies. What have you done to challenge your fellow billionaires when it comes to this inequity? And what would you do as president?
So, let me say this. I started a business. I ran it for 27 years. I started in one room with no employees, not even any windows in the room. Then I took the giving pledge to give more than half my money to good causes while I was alive. I walked away from my business to build coalitions of normal American citizens to take on unchecked corporate power. And together, we've been beating them for over a decade. I've taken on the oil companies, I've taken on the tobacco companies, I've taken on the utilities, I've taken on the drug companies. So Amy, when you ask me what I'm going to do, the reason I'm running for president is because I believe these corporations have bought the government. Reason for running. We're not getting what we want. We're not getting anything we want until we break. They are strangling our government and they are strangling us. And until we beat them, we're getting nothing, because that's what they want us to have. So when I look about clean air and clean water, when I look at environmental racism, we're going to have to beat the corporation first. And there's no one else who's going to come on this stage, there's no one else running for president who's going to talk about term limits for every congressperson and senator, 12 years. There's no one who's going to talk about a national referendum to let the people of the United States pass laws when the Congress won't do it, take away their monopoly to pass laws. So this is my whole, look, I have a track record for a decade as an outsider of taking these people on. They're not that smart, but they are that mean. And what I've seen, and honestly, environmental racism is a perfect example. They are willing to hurt people for money. And it's not a heck of a lot more complicated than that. And so what am I willing to do? I am willing to do whatever it takes to break that corporate stranglehold. And that's my history.
Do you think corporate executives should be put on trial? For example, in New York, you have the lawsuit against ExxonMobil. If you can explain the significance of this lawsuit, just last week, 30 school children led a 42-minute die-in outside the ExxonMobil trial as Rex Tillerson, the former CEO of ExxonMobil, the former Secretary of State under Trump, was testifying. 42 minutes, as one 13-year-old activist, Maria Riker, said to us, 42 minutes for the 42 years that ExxonMobil covered up climate change.
So, let me say this about corporations. They're not above the law. So what does that mean? It means if they paid $300 billion worth of fines because of the mortgage crisis and no one went to jail, how could that be right? If we put drug dealers in jail, why don't we put corporate drug dealers in jail? If Exxon lied and endangered the health and safety, not just of everybody in this room, but everybody in this country, are you telling me they're above the law because they did it within a corporate system? No way. So you're asking me, Amy, what am I willing to do? I'm willing to hold them accountable for crime. And I'm going to, they are not above the law. If I'm not scared of the president, I promise you I'm not scared of the ExxonMobil Corporation.
So let me ask one last follow-up. In the last weeks, in a leaked audio recording, Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO of Facebook, was captured on tape saying, and I what are your comments about what he had to say?
Look, by and for the people. We have got to take away the rights of the heads of these huge corporations like Mark Zuckerberg to think they run our country for themselves and their corporations. That's got to end. So who gets elected president should be dependent on who's going to do the best job for the American people, who can they trust, and who calls out the problem. This election is about calling out the problem. And the problem is they own the government. And we're not changing anything until we change that.
Instance that we find ourselves in right now. So at the Environmental Protection Agency, the enforcement work that has happened there has become minimized greatly. The cases that are brought forward, inspectors going out making sure that businesses and industries are in compliance. So what would be your plan to enhance enforcement that would help the communities that are here in the audience?
So I just want to start with the fact that every Environmental Protection Agency, they're there to enforce that. And if they're corporations who are poisoning us, then we have to know it and we have to end it and we have to punish it. So when I think about the Environmental Protection Agency, it's got to be an enforcement agency that is carrying out the right of every single American to clean air and clean water. And we're going to make that happen. So part of it's enforcement, but a big part of this is bringing the money, bringing the resources to the communities that don't have clean air and clean water, and making sure that we rebuild in a way that they do.
Well, let me follow up on that just real quickly. So we know that the funding limited. How would you redirect resources to help those communities?
So Mustafa, I would use the emergency powers of the presidency, because it's an emergency, to change the rules without needing Congress. I'm going to ask Congress. I'm going to give them 100 days. Pass the Green New Deal. I'm begging you. But they're 0 for 28 years. So for everybody who's counting on the Green New Deal, this is a group that's 0 for 28 years. And I want to say, on day one, we're getting going. So what am I going to do? On day one, we're using the emergency powers of the presidency to get going on this problem with environmental justice, the redress of environmental racism at the core of what we do.
Provide for tribal nations, communities who wish to make a just transition towards sustainable housing and renewable energy? And how would you negotiate with tribes? For example, what would you do around pipelines? Standing Rock Sioux Reservation wants the Dakota Access Pipeline stopped now.
So anyway, no pipelines. That's my rule on pipelines. Look, I was an investor for 30 years, and people love to talk in politics about infrastructure, and they make it sound like infrastructure is in and of itself a good thing. But if you're an investor, infrastructure is just building something and paying for it. So if you build something stupid, it's stupid. And if you build something smart and sustainable, that's valuable. So when we think about rebuilding America, we've got to think about doing it in a way that actually serves the American people, that makes it possible for us to preserve the natural world that God gave us, and lets us hand it on to the next generation. So when I think about what we're going to do with indigenous people, for starters, we're not building any more pipelines across their lands. We don't have to worry about it. That's out. But I also think we've got to respect their knowledge and their awareness and give them the right of self-determination.
We just heard some very eloquent environmental justice activists talk about the destruction of their communities over decades by industrial polluters that destroy their communities and then up and leave. What would reparations look like?
It means acknowledging what's happened, being aware of what's happened, and then letting the leaders from those communities direct how we're going to undo it. That's actually what it looks like, Amy.
And what would an activated Justice Department look like?
I would create an environmental justice department within the Justice Department. I don't think there's any way that we can actually deal with this in a significant fashion without separating it out, concentrating on it, and giving people the right and the obligation to pursue it seriously. People to justice.
And I think we're going to go to a question from
Call me Tom, Brandon. Make me feel young.
Hey, Tom, okay. My question is, one of the issues to environmental justice is access to healthy food. What would you do to give access to healthy food to all Americans?
Really close to my heart, because in California, my wife and I have started a program called California Food for California Kids, which is doing farm to table in the public schools. We're in schools that provide 300 million. Food deserts in this country where people can't find healthy food to buy in their neighborhoods. And that's got to be addressed. But even more than that, we have hunger in this country. And, you know, I have talked to young people who have told me that they and their friends are routine. For the basic needs of citizens, and food has got to be one of them. And the fact that we're having this conversation in 2019 in the richest country in the history of the world shows how far off we've gone from what's right. Look, I'm running because I believe these corporations have bought the government, and I believe that they've trashed, that they've stomped on the absolute rights of Americans. And that includes the right to affordable health care for every American, the right to quality public education from pre-K through college, the right to a living wage. Every one job should be enough. The way the money's being distributed is shameful. And the right to clean air and clean water. But good grief, food, the right to food and a roof over your head, that's part of America. So when you ask me, what am I willing to do? Amy was asking me, what am I willing to do to let people live without being poisoned? We've got to change the United States. Something has gone terribly wrong, and we like to make it seem too complicated. It's not complicated. What they're doing is cutting taxes on rich people and big corporations, and then they're taking away education funds, healthcare funds, attacking unions and working people's right to earn, and allowing pollution. That's their whole economic program. And the reason we have to take away their right to write the laws, take away their stranglehold of our government, is we need to undo every single one of those things. We need to give back to the American people our share of this country. And it can no longer be run for these corporations. The idea that young people in America, that we would question whether it's a good investment that young people be fed, makes no sense. Of course, the way we're going to succeed is by investing in Americans. That's how we're going to prosper, by Americans succeeding. And so if we invest, Brandon, in young people, including education and food and a roof over their head, that's the best investment we'll ever make. That's the investment that will make us succeed. That's the investment that will make us proud. And that's the investment we will definitely make, but first we're gonna have to break these corporations. And that's why I'm running for president, because I never wanna hear that question. What are we gonna do to provide food for young people? We should already have done that.
I'd like to ask you, Tom Steyer, about foreign policy. As president, of course, a critical area. We're speaking to you just hours after a court in Brazil has released the former president of Brazil, Lula, after he was imprisoned under this administration of the far-right president, Jair Bolsonaro, who basically says the Amazon is open for business, the lungs of the planet. We're speaking to you in the week that President Trump has said he's moving forward with Davos in the desert, what many call the disaster in the desert, where President Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, his Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, and other corporate executives went to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, essentially shoring up the regime there, as Human Rights Watch has come out with a report talking about the catastrophe that Mohammed bin Salman represents when it comes to, for example, human rights activists, particularly the abuse of women in prison. What would you do about these relationships with the fossil fuel giant that is Saudi Arabia, with the close relationship Trump has with Bolsonaro?
So let me say this. Every single thing that Mr. Trump believes about he believes we can only confront people and compete with them and try and bully them. He doesn't believe that we can cooperate with people and create coalitions the way President Obama did. And in particular, he doesn't believe that we can lead the world on values. His friends are all dictators. Everything he stands for, I disagree with. And let me say this, the number one thing I would do in foreign policy is lead the world on climate and restore the United States as the moral leaders of the world. Look, I don't believe we can solve the climate crisis without putting environmental justice at the heart. But I also don't believe we can solve the climate crisis inside the borders of the United States. I think we have to lead the rest of the world. In fact, we all know we have to lead the rest of the world. And there's no second choice. So if we're going to rebuild the United States, if we're going to undo the inherent racism in the way we've polluted, if we're going to create millions of jobs and rebuild our spiritual center here, we're also going to have to do it around the world. And that is actually going to be the rebirth of us as the moral leaders of the world and the technological leaders of the world and the financial and commercial leaders. This is what we're going to have to do. We can do it. We can definitely do it. It's going to make us better employed, more jobs, better paying jobs, healthier, and it's going to restore the moral center to the United States of America to where it should be, where we stand up for our values here, justice at home, values abroad. That's what we're going to do.
To impact climate change?
Well, I do think declaring a state of emergency on day one counts as bold. I do think that making it environmental justice focused and have the planning process go from community up is bold. And I think that making it the heart of my international policy is bold. But I think the biggest thing, Mustafa, that I see is we don't have a choice here, and we don't have a choice in succeeding unless we put morality at the center, which means justice at the center. This isn't going to work unless we do it in a way that we understand what's been unjust, where there's been racism, where there has been cruelty. We acknowledge it and we undo it. That is actually how we're going to succeed in dealing with climate.
Tom Steyer, you've been leading a movement to impeach President Trump. When it comes to the issue of environmental justice and environmental racism, what would be the articles of impeachment you would write against him?
For Mr. Trump? Oh my goodness gracious. To impeach movement that more than 8 million people signed on to over 2 years ago. But I want to be clear that I wasn't the first person, and there is a congressman from Houston, Texas, named Al Green, who beat me to it, who I have a lot of respect for. And I've talked to Congressman Green multiple times, and he always says to me, Tom, I know that this guy's a criminal and you're holding him up to the world as a criminal, but I'm pushing for him to be impeached and removed because he's a racist. And that's my reason. So everything else to me is secondary. So when I look at what he's done from withdrawing the people he's appointed to all of the environmental posts who are apologists for fossil fuels, withdrawing from Paris to show the world he has disdain for even attempting it, trying to increase the subsidies to fossil fuels, cutting the heart out of the EPA. You know, he's never missed an opportunity to do the right thing, to do the wrong thing. He's never been right. It's kind of like if you imagine the worst thing he could do, he immediately does it. So but look, you can't impeach a president on policy. This president is a criminal. You can impeach a president who's a criminal for criminal acts. And the fact that his policy is also dead wrong is not a coincidence, but you have to get him on the criminal acts, Amy, and he's done a lot of them. You guys know, this is where my heart is. Seriously. This is not, I started by saying this is not a side issue for me. This is the issue. This is how we rebuild a great country together. And we have to acknowledge where we are. Thank you.
Ever Presidential Forum on Environmental Justice. I am Amy Goodman with Mustafa Ali, and today we're going to hear from 6 presidential candidates. All were invited. Coming up, Senator Elizabeth Warren and Senator Cory Booker, John Delaney, Joe Sistak, and Marianne Williamson. We're broadcasting from South Carolina State University here in Orangeburg. Next up, Senator Elizabeth Warren will take the stage and give a 3-minute address on environmental justice.
The best part about this is not what we have to say, any of the candidates who are here. It's that you're here. It's that you're lifting this issue and making this a major issue in a presidential debate. That we're not just talking about climate change, we're talking about environmental justice. We're talking about justice in this country. We're talking about who's been left behind, who's been deliberately shut out of the process, and what we can do to make real change. And for me, that means big structural change. So I'm glad to be here. It's good to see you all. So here are the points I want to make in my little bit at the top. And the first is, we know we've got a problem. And the problem is one of communities that just consistently have been the places for the location of the dumps, the waste. It's communities that are poor and communities of color. It's about racism and it is about economic injustice. So that's part one. Part two is it's not going to be enough just to come out and say, I care about that. It's not enough to say, yeah, this is a problem, and when we're talking about making changes, we also need to stop every now and again and think about environmental justice. For me, the way I think about this is if you're really serious, then you gotta have some concrete proposals, some real plans on the table. So I just wanna mention, the way I see this is I've made a commitment. I wanna spend $3 trillion on our climate change and how to fight climate change over the next few years when I'm president. I will spend 1/3 of that in the communities that have been most devastated by our past racism, by our past attacks on these communities, and that have left them so devastated. Cope with environmental justice for generation after generation, and to say, let's lay out a plan for how to spend that money. Let's lay out a plan for how to lift up the communities that have been left behind. Let's make a plan together for big structural change. So that's why I'm here. I'm glad to be here.
So many communities of color, low-income communities, and indigenous populations are literally dying for a breath of fresh air. We have 100,000 people who are dying prematurely from air pollution in our country. Communities like the Manchester community in Houston, Texas, to Cancer Alley running between Baton Rouge and Louisiana, or even here in Charleston, South Carolina. What would you do to address the epidemic that's happening in our communities from air pollution?
So part of it. But it is, as they have tried to roll back, the Trump administration and the EPA under his administration have tried to roll back air quality standards. We need to go in the other direction. We need to roll forward. And so we need to be much stronger in this. But can I add a second part to that? Because I think it's really important. And that is, I want to bring in the CDC. I want to treat this as the public health emergency that it is. Yeah. If people were dying of a mysterious virus, if it were cutting lives short in well-to-do communities, you better believe that we'd be coming in with the research, we'd be highlighting where the problems are, and we'd be figuring out how to fix them and to fix them fast. Instead, we just watch over and over and over how children who live in poor communities, who live in communities of color, have higher rates of hospitalization for asthma. Why? Because what they burn in Ohio, you breathe in Massachusetts, and it's hard on our children. Because our children are the most vulnerable, and they live next to the places public health emergency that it is. I want the scientists on it, and I want to put the real resources behind fixing it.
Thank you.
Tom Steyer said he would declare a state of climate emergency the first day he were president. Would you do the same?
We could. You know, here's how I think of this. I want to use the tools available as president. And the way I think of using the tools, I want to think about what, I love saying this, a president can do all by herself. And to address the injustices that we currently face on this issue. So for me, what I have committed to do is both to create a position in the White House, and in the first 100 days, not just to do it all by myself on this one, but to ask the groups that have been on the front lines to be part of this, to come together and to start putting together an action plan. And the reason I say that is when we're talking about the question of environmental justice, it's a highly localized problem. You need national muscle, you need national money. It's different. It's different on tribal lands out west than it is in sinking cities near the coast. It is different to be near a dump that smolders and burns than it is to be near a factory that continues to put poisons into the water. And so for each of those, the way I see this is you make the concrete commitment on finances, you make the concrete commitment on bringing people together, and then you ask the communities to identify what needs to be done. And then if I can, the third part is we have to look at this holistically. It's not just about cleaning up the dumps. It's not just about making the factories either filter what they're putting into the air and the water or shutting down. It's also about lifting these communities up, because these communities have been damaged for generation after generation. So it's about investments, which I'd love to talk about, in housing. It's about economic investments, investments in schools. It's about making the investments in these communities so we go from communities that, as you say, are literally killing people to communities that are actually thriving. That's what I want to see.
Where do you stand, not just on the Dakota Access Pipeline being built, it has been now, and it's operating at a great capacity, but now the Standing Rock Sewer in court, they're saying a proper environmental impact statement wasn't done, and that the Dakota Access Pipeline should be shut down. Do you agree with this? What would you do as president, both on Dakota Access Pipeline, the Keystone XL that President Trump greenlighted, and pipelines overall across the country?
So let me start by saying I believe we ought to enforce our environmental laws. What it means to have these laws is that we enforce these laws. But if I can, I want to add an extra piece, because I think this really brings in the question of tribal governance and tribes' abilities to be the good stewards of their land. I have already made a very public commitment to the tribes, both to honor that the tribes themselves make the decision about what happens on tribal lands. This is a nation-to-nation relationship. This is about our trust and treaty obligations. But I go a step further, and to say on federal lands that abut tribal lands, that as president, I will not approve any drilling, mining pipelines that abut those lands, on these federal lands, that abut the tribal lands, unless the tribes that are affected give their own informed consent in advance. I believe that they will be the good stewards of the land, and I believe they will protect the region.
Are you for the shutting down of the Dakota Access Pipeline?
And how would you better protect? You know, we have this shrinking of our
president can do all by herself. And on day one, I will say no new drilling, no new mining on our federal lands and no offshore drilling. Just shut it down. And you know, that's actually a pretty big impact because, as you know, about a quarter of our lands are federal. And leaving behind waste for not only local communities to have to deal with, for the tribes to have to deal with, but destroying pristine lands for generations to come. I believe that we have both a strong economic, I'll start there, obligation, but also a strong moral obligation to protect our public lands and make sure they remain safe. I have fought the Trump administration's efforts to try to undo protection of our federal lands, and I will be a careful protector of those lands. You know, I'll just add on this. I know we talk about the huge ramifications. For me, it's also personal. My husband and I are hikers. We've hiked many of these federal lands for decades now. And when we were hiking not long ago, we were talking about what it would mean if our grandchildren won't come and see what we see. If our grandchildren will be denied the opportunity to come out and see some of the greatest beauties on this earth. We have an obligation to future generations. It's not about what they will inherit, it's about what we are borrowing from them. And we must meet that obligation. We must meet it because it is right for our country, because it is right for this world, but also because it is morally right. We need to live our values.
Do you think Tom Perez, the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, is wrong to say no to a debate specifically on the climate crisis?
Yes.
How can you prevail upon him and the DNC to change their mind?
I've already weighed in on this one quite publicly and asked for a I think this is the urgent issue of our time. You know, I don't have to say it to you, but it is worth repeating every chance we get, that climate change threatens every living thing on this planet, and that everything else we talk about depends on our having an earth that we can live on for generations to come. So I think as Democrats, we should be happy to get together to lift this issue. As I said, I'm happy to be here now in this forum to lift this issue for people all around the country and all around the world. The United States is a leader on climate. We are. Right now, we're just leading in the wrong direction. We need to show that that's not all of America. That is not who we are as Americans. That we treasure this land and we treasure this planet, and we're willing to put real resources behind protecting it.
Where we lost over 3,000 lives, to Princeville, North Carolina, founded by freed slaves, and have had to deal with these devastating floods. We used to talk about 50-year floods. Now we're talking about 100-year floods and 500-year floods, all the way, of course, to what happened in New Orleans from Katrina. So we asked the previous candidate, who is sitting in the chair that you are, what would be your boldest move on climate change? What would be yours?
$1 trillion.
I think it's pretty bold.
No, this is it's important. This is why I said I think it's important to have climate plan. And oh yeah, we'll think about environmental justice somewhere along the way and get it and say the right things, but somehow in the decision making it just never happens. I don't want to be that president. I want to be a president who commits in advance and says, we know we have a serious problem here. So I've got a plan to put about $3 trillion into climate remediation, direct dollars out of the federal government, a lot of leverage out of that. What I do is I commit to take a third of that and say we're going to spend it on environmental justice. We're going to spend it on going to the communities that are hit first, that are hit hardest, that have been hit the longest, generation after generation. As I said, I don't want to dictate from Washington what it takes. You know, it may be a seawall in one place, it may be a sandbar in a different one, it may be relocation in some. You hate to say it, but it may be. There are all kinds of differences in how it should happen. And that's the respect for the communities and for the community groups that have been fighting this for so long. But the role of the federal government is to protect. The role of the federal government is to provide the resources. The role of the federal government is to make sure that as a country, we leave no communities behind.
Let me just follow up real quickly on that. Have $1 trillion, $2 trillion, $3 trillion on the federal level. How will we ensure on the state level that they do the right things to address the impacts that are happening in our communities?
So that communities have the ability to come in and say, here's our problem, we qualify for federal funds, so you don't have a governor or a state legislature in between sucking up that money that comes in buckets and ends up being distributed to some communities with an eyedropper. So that's part one. But the second part, I think, is you are right. We need states to have their own environmental laws. We should do this at the federal level, but we need environmental. Strengthen the groups on the ground. So think of it as an action like this. When you've got a federal government, when you've got a president who is really committed on environmental issues, and you've got a lot of local groups that both have the ability to get to funding, have the ability to make a difference in their communities, that strengthens those groups. That strengthens those communities. And that gives them a lot more muscle to deal with state governments that may otherwise have overlooked them.
Senator Warren, you've said a crucial distinction between you and Bernie Sanders is that you're a capitalist and he's a socialist. Many activists, though, say that an economic system based on perpetual growth is fundamentally at odds with a stable, clean, and sustainable environment. How do you reconcile this?
So, you know, the way I see this, I believe in markets. I think markets bring us a lot of innovation, a lot of creation, a lot of change. That's good. I want to see, for example, markets for clean. Not just clean energy, but how we're going to clean the carbon out of the air, how we're going to clean the filth out of the water. But understand this, markets without rules are theft. They're theft. It allows, whenever you get a chance, when you have a market that people get to, corporations get to cheat people, that's theft. That's not a market. And that's not how markets are supposed to operate. So my efforts for many years now have been about how we get those markets to function so that we get the best out of the markets, but that people don't get cheated. And maybe the best example of that is in the early 2000s, so dangerous and so complex that someone who got a mortgage had a 1 in 5 chance of losing their home over that mortgage. Not through a fire, but through foreclosure. Communities of color were targeted for the worst of the worst mortgage. And the government, they weren't on the side of the people. They were deep in the pockets of the big banks. In fact, so deep that they let the big banks sell enough of those mortgages to crash the entire economy. So after that crash, I had an idea. And the idea was for a consumer agency that would come in just like a consumer agency that protects you from buying toasters that would burst into flames, a consumer agency that would protect people who are buying mortgages and credit cards and student loans and be on the side of the consumer. And people told me, don't even try to do it because you never get it passed. The big banks will stop you, big money, the Republicans, and frankly, a whole bunch of the Democrats. But it was the right thing to do. So I got in that fight. A bunch of consumer groups helped out in that fight. And we took on Wall Street. We took on the big money. And President Obama signed that agency into law in 2010. It has now, yes. $12 billion directly to people who are cheating. Now, we know how to make government work for the people, and that means you've got to have rules. I don't want to get rid of those devices. I don't want to get rid of credit cards. I kind of like my credit card. I just don't want them to be able to cheat me or anyone else. For me, that's what this is all about.
Can I follow up?
Sure.
Ask you to respond.
Somebody has a great idea and they follow it through and they work hard and they build something, good for them. But here's my pitch. You built a great fortune in this country, good for you. But you built it at least in part using workers all of us help pay to educate. You built it at least in part getting your goods to market on roads and bridges all of us help pay to build. You built it, at least in part, protected by police and firefighters, all of us help pay their salaries for. So here's my view. You make it to the top, to the tip top, then the answer is pay a wealth tax so that we
CEO of Facebook, who said that a Warren presidency would suck for his company. That was in an audio leak that came out.
boo-hoo.
Which brings me to the Climate Accountability Institute, which said the world's wealthiest corporations are most responsible for the climate crisis, which of course impacts most people of color and poorest communities. More than 70% of global emissions come from just 100 companies.
Right.
What do you think should be done to challenge this, change this? What would you do as president?
Well,
and what are you doing as senator?
Well, part one is we can regulate it. Look, three industries. We put serious regulations in place and say there can't be any new buildings, any new homes built after 2028, zero carbon emission. 2030, zero carbon emission on all automobiles and light trucks produced. And by 2035, zero carbon emission on all electric production. Three industries. We can cut carbon emission in the United States of America by 70%. Three industries. So there's one of your tools, is regulation. Right there, you've got to be willing to come in on the regulation. But let me make another point about this. Understand, those giant companies you're talking about, yeah, they do a lot of terrible things. But they also have a lot of power. And they exercise that power. They exercise that power over their workers. They exercise it over their customers, over the communities where they're located, and over the government in Washington. That is corruption, pure and simple. And we need to call it out and fight back. What I want to do on the first day as president, the legislation I want to push through is anti-corruption legislation. I want to get in there and fight the oil companies, the big polluters. Because here's the deal. Anybody who comes up here and tells you about their climate plans, who doesn't have an anti-corruption plan, who doesn't have a plan to beat back the influence of money in Washington, is but what it will really do is continue to carve out enough exceptions that the profits keep flowing to the same people who are getting those profits right now. So I'm out there to fight this corruption. That has to be step number one, is to go after them.
Corporate executives who pollute go to jail.
If they do harm to people, they need to be held responsible. And I actually have a bill already on this. You shouldn't be able to walk away from the injuries you create. No one should be able to do that in the United States. We've got a problem right now in this country, and the problem we've got is too much power is concentrated in the hands of the wealthy. To keep Washington exactly where they want it. You know, it's not only what Donald Trump has done in the Environmental Protection Agency, it's decades of this. People talk about a Washington that doesn't work. Washington works great if you're rich. Washington works great if you run a giant corporation. Understand, when this administration wanted to get something done, tax cuts for their big donors, you know how long it took them? 5 weeks. They went behind closed doors with their big donors and the lobbyists, scribbled out the bill and passed it, and $1.5 trillion went out the door, mostly to giant corporations and rich people. They know how to get something done. When nothing is getting done on climate, when nothing is getting done on gun safety, when nothing is getting done on the cost of prescription drugs, ask yourself who benefits from that, right? It's the gun industry, it's the polluters, it's the drilling industry, it's the pharmaceutical industry. They are getting the Washington they want. What 2020 is all about is it's time for us to get the Washington that works for the people, not the one that just works for the big corporations.
Senator Warren, we're going to go to a question from one of our students. So if Vladimir Haynes could come forward and pose your question to Senator Warren.
I'm good.
Haynes, my question for you, Senator Warren, is how can you ensure that no community will be left behind when it comes to the fight of environmental injustice? And I am a junior agribusiness major as well as a member of the SDSU football team.
Whoa! What position do you play?
Fullback and tight end.
All right. It's good to see you, and it's a good question. I think the way we do that is we make specific commitments. We can't make environmental justice an afterthought. It has to be a part of our climate plan designed from the beginning. So partly, this is why I talk about a commitment, a financial commitment, that goes to the frontline and fence line communities. Partly, it's why I talk about the commitment to our Native American tribes and their dominion over not just their tribal lands, but the lands that are adjacent to them, because that's what it takes to protect our earth. Partly, it's about attacking the health aspects, coming at this from a different perspective, so that we start to look at this as a public health problem and we lift that up. I think in each case, the more attention we can bring in the more directions, that's how we make sure that the communities that have been hardest hit are not left behind. This is why, as president, I want to make this a part of what I do in the White House. I don't want it something that people just come in. And by the way, I should add to that, I want to make it a part of what every agency does. So I want our agencies, I want our banking regulators to be thinking about climate risk. Think about that. I want them to be thinking about that. I want our Department of Labor to be thinking about what it means. The Trump administration has rollback protections for people who work in dangerous areas, what they breathe, what kind of chemicals they're exposed to. I want each and every one of our departments to have someone at the top, near the top, who is thinking about the environmental impact of what happens, what that agency approves of, what that agency is responsible for, and what it means in the communities that are most affected. We need a lot of change, big change, but I believe we can do this together. This is one of these that's about leadership at the top, and it's about powerful communities at the grassroots all across this country. That's how we make change.
Senator Warren, just a quick question. So many of our most vulnerable communities are being gentrified.
Yeah.
They're being gentrified from the impacts from climate change. They're being gentrified by the guise of revitalization. What would you do about this displacement that is continuing to happen?
So can I just do this one? I'll start on housing, because this is the biggest area. We got a housing crisis in this country. Gentrification is certainly part of it, but think about it in a larger context. 2 generations ago, where was the source of new housing for working families, for the working poor, for the poor poor? Where was it? You had 2 places. One were private developers. They're not there anymore. They're not building that housing. They're building McMansions. And I'm not mad at them. That's where their profits are. But they've left the area. I grew up in a 2-bedroom, 1-bath little house. It was in the last row of last street in Norman, Oklahoma. The garage had been converted into a bedroom for my 3 brothers. Nobody's building that house anymore. They're not private developers. Second part is federal government that used to pump money into housing and has really largely backed out of that. So I have a plan for that, and that is to build about 3.2 million new housing units across America. We need more housing in America. And this is housing for working families, it's housing for the working poor, it's housing for the poor poor, it's housing for the homeless, it's housing for seniors who want to be able to age in place, it's housing for people with disabilities who need specially outfitted housing, it's housing for people who are returning from prison and who need a place to be able to live. We need to build more housing in this country. An independent analysis shows that my plan would reduce rents across the nation by about 10%. And what they do is they let people, we've got to get these down into the communities. They let people stay in the communities. They let people have new housing in those communities, housing that they can afford and be part of. And then one other little part, when you're talking about housing, is the role that housing plays in wealth. You know, the #1 savings plan in America is buy a house for middle-class families. #1 retirement plan. Live in your house and try to pay it off and then live on your Social Security when you retire. It's the #1 way that wealth is transmitted from one generation to the next. If grandma and grandpa can hold on to the house until they pass, there's something there for the kids and the grandkids and the great-grandkids. So it should be no surprise to you that for generations, the American government, the federal government, subsidized the purchase of housing for white people and discriminated against the purchase of housing for black people. It's called redlining. And it created a black-white wealth gap that continues even to this day because of the generational effects as well as what's happened in these communities. So my housing plan is not only about 3.2 million new housing units across this country, in little communities and big cities all across America. It also says we've got to stop and recognize the racial dimension of what happened here. So I have first-time home buyer assistance for people who live in formerly redlined communities and people who were targeted during the financial crash and lost their homes. So we give people a chance to get back on level footing. We can't keep passing these laws that are racially neutral on their face. We say, oh, same housing for everybody. We've got to acknowledge the past wrongs that are still felt today, the past official discrimination of the United States government that is still felt today, and we got to take steps toward making that right, and that's what my housing plan is.
Senator Warren, just 30 seconds left. But speaking about racial injustice, do you think the order of the primary states should change? You have Iowa and New Hampshire.
Wait, let me just, before you finish, are you actually going to ask me to sit here and criticize Iowa and New Hampshire?
No, I'm asking about the order.
Well, that is what Iowa
But
and New Hampshire
let me
are all
just
about.
ask, they're two of the whitest states in the country. And then we move to South Carolina with a very significant population of people of color. And it means the candidates spend so much of their time catering to those first two states. Overall, do you think that should change?
I'm just a player in the game on this one. And I am delighted to be in South Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Senator Elizabeth Warren. Next up, we will be joined by Senator Cory Booker. He will be followed by John Delaney, Joe Sestak, as well as Marianne Williamson. Senator Cory Booker will speak for 3 minutes, and then we'll have a conversation. You're tuned in right now to the first ever Presidential Forum on Environmental Justice. I am Amy Goodman with Mustafa Santiago Ali. And we're seeing right now if Senator Cory Booker is in the wings.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you?
Good. So you have 3 minutes to freely associate with the audience here.
Really associate with the audience. I'm here because of Mustafa. No, I'm very serious. Mustafa called me up and said, this is an important forum. We've had forums about every issue in this campaign that I can imagine. The two ones that most disappointed me are this one and the one on criminal justice reform with formerly incarcerated people. Because those two forums, 2020 doesn't stand for the year we're running, it stands for the number of people that are in this race, 2020 of us. But I'm disappointed because the two issues that disproportionately affect people of color have had the least attendance of the folks. Now, Mustafa, the reason why I'm here is because when I called him up as a United States Senator, having come from a community, I'm the only person in the United States Senate that lives in a low-income black and brown community. And when I called him up because I wanted to deal with issues of environmental injustice, this brother got into multiple types of vehicles, and we went through this nation. We have a shameful reality in America. From Duplin County, North Carolina, where the pig farms and the corporate industrial agriculture is poisoning our soil and our rivers, to Uniontown, Alabama, where they take coal ash from some communities and dump it into African-American community, to Cancer Alley, to Newark, New Jersey, to the 3,000 jurisdictions where children have more than twice the lead levels of Flint, Michigan. This is not a presidential issue for me. This has been my entire career working on issues of environmental injustice. The major bill in the Senate is the one that I wrote, and I say I wrote them, you know this. We actually called the activists together to write the bill. The caucus, first ever Environmental Justice Caucus, I founded in the United States Senate. I'm here tonight because I owe loyalty to the guy behind me, because I know he is for real, and there's a whole lot of talk on issues like this, not enough action.
So we know that currently our federal agencies have withdrawn themselves from addressing environmental injustices that are going on. Can you talk about what your administration will do to fix that problem?
I'm smiling because he's asking me questions that he knows we've talked about. So first and foremost, what he means by the federal agencies pulling back is the EPA, they're at half the levels they were in 2010 on inspections right now. The money they're collecting from corporate polluters is at like a 15-year low. We have a federal government that right now is saying we're going to let corporate polluters do what they want to do. And we're in a time of Grover Norquist, you know, this era where Republican legislators signed this pledge, no new taxes. This didn't start in the time of Trump, this has been going on for a long time, which means a lot of the mechanisms we had before to clean up these environmental sites, the federal government is no longer pulling in the resources, the taxes necessary to clean it up. One great example of this is just the cleanup of Superfund sites in America. We had a bipartisan accord. In fact, Reagan reauthorized a small tax on corporate polluters, chemical companies like those that are in Cancer Alley, to give us a fund to clean up Superfund sites. Well, even though that Mitch McConnell voted on it when Reagan was president, he refused to reauthorize it now. And what we see now is because there's no money in the Superfund cleanup funds, you see the number of Superfund sites growing in America. And so I have a very strong belief, and it's in the legislation that Mustafa was one of the people who helped us write, is I just don't trust the government right now on this issue. And that means that one of the best ways to deal with this issue is to push the power back to people. And so my legislation that I wrote when I was senator that will become law if I'm president of the United States is to make sure that local communities have the power, have standing to sue their governments, which right now they can't. And so we know there's a lot of communities, if they could sue their governments and had standing, we would see a lot more action. And we want to change, our legislation changes the ability to not just sue them, but to actually collect damages as well. I believe that as an African American, I know the legal system, all the way from Brown versus Board of Education to incredible work done by great legal activists like Charles Hamilton Houston and others, giving the legal power back to communities to defend themselves is utterly important. And that's just one tool of the multiple tools that I want to do to make sure that we begin to have a country where people can trust the air that they're breathing, or the water that they're drinking, or the soil which they want to plant crops in.
Senator Booker, I wanted to ask you about nuclear energy. You are a proud proponent of nuclear energy, have argued it's necessary to wean us off the fossil fuel economy. But you have a lot of environmental activists who are scratching their heads at your support for nuclear energy, particularly around the issue of nuclear waste. Here in South Carolina, for example, there are 35 million gallons of nuclear waste being held at a nuclear reserve south of Aiken. Environmental activists have been fighting it for years. You've got Savannah River. And of course, we're talking about communities, primarily low-income communities of color, who are dealing with nuclear waste in their own backyards, from New Mexico to Yucca Mountain to right here. What is your answer to the fact that there is no solution in dealing with nuclear waste?
Well, first of all, you're a little bit mischaracterizing my views. I'm a realist that tells you right now the biggest existential threat to humanity is climate change. 50% of our non-carbon producing power right now is nuclear. And so what some of my other opponents want to do is just get rid of it. It's going to push us back to being more reliant on fossil fuels and make this, our ability to reach our climate goals, impossible. We saw what happened in Vermont when they cut down the Yankee plant there. Their carbon footprint expanded pretty significantly. So I look forward to phasing out nuclear waste and nuclear energy. But to do it right now, when we are in a race and have a 12-year race to meet our climate goals, the damage done to poor and vulnerable communities is significantly worse coming from climate change than it is the crisis of nuclear energy. If you want to weigh your poisons right now, the one that's coming towards us like a barreling freight truck of climate change, the one that my community in Newark is feeling right now because temperature rises, asthma rates that are off the charts. And let me tell you something about asthma. As a guy that knows what it's like in emergency rooms with black children dying at 10 times the rate than white children of asthma complications. So for me, nuclear energy, it's just common sense to me right now.
To build new power plants?
No, well, let's be clear. The nuclear energy of the plants we have now, designed in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, is very different than the new modular nuclear energy plants that are being proposed. Now, those actually have a much, they can actually take spent fuel rods and re-engage them for usage. The frontiers of nuclear science is not something we should just shut down. We should continue to investigate. Is there going to be eventually a safe way to do this? So I don't mind exploring the future. I'm one of these people that considers myself a futurist. Why? Because you have two choices in life: to let the future happen to you, or to shape the future and make sure it happens in a way that's just. So this to me is a very, very simple equation. Is I've got a 12-year problem to solve. And if anybody wants to get rid of nuclear energy, tell me how you're going to replace 50% of the non-carbon producing power that we would have right now. Because what you're going to do, you're going to send us back to coal and oil, and I refuse to go backwards in the cause of environmental justice.
What is your plan for renewables, for pushing forward solar and wind and other forms of sustainable energy?
Well, this is what gets me frustrated about this conversation sometimes, is because you got a bunch of people running for president who've been in public life for 20 years. Maybe the question is what the heck have you been doing on these issues for the entire time? So you should know I have a record on these issues. Number one is I do not believe that oil companies and coal companies should get tax breaks. It's ridiculous that we are extending tax breaks in a way that companies like Chevron pay a net zero. In fact, they pay a negative tax rate right now because of all the stuff we're foisting upon them. And so that's number one, rolling back those tax breaks. And number two is extending them to renewables. I fought not just for, when I was in the Senate, we were able to win a 7-year tax credit for, renewable tax credit for wind and solar, which is really important because you need some predictability if you're going to be investing in those areas. But we wanted to see it for everything from geothermal to battery life. We wanted to extend it for every type of renewable there is. Well, if I'm president, we're going to make sure that we create a better incentive model for people to be doubling down in investments. In addition to that, we're going to create moonshots all around this country for science and research in the renewable space, which is critical because right now other countries are beating us in the race to solve these problems through innovation. And therefore, they're going to beat us in the race to create the new jobs that are being created. Right now, there's more jobs in solar than there are in coal, but we have many things that we could be doing. So for me, this is all about making sure that we're doing everything we can to incentivize investments, research, development, and to get to the point where I want to be, which is to have the electrification of our transportation sector by 2030, and then to be carbon neutral as a nation by 2045.
Senator Booker, I want to build on what you were just talking about, because in our new clean economy that we are currently developing, and we know it's going to grow over the years, when we look at those who are currently working in that space, we have some evolution to make sure that there are more folks of color in that space. Yeah. When we look at the ownership of the businesses there, we also, I think it's less than 2% of those businesses that are currently in the clean economy that are owned by folks of color. So what would your administration do to make sure that those numbers increase?
You know, when you're in a car with Mustafa, you end up talking about a lot of things. Look, let's just be clear right now. We live in a country where there are savage racial disparities in every single corner of our lives. There are racial disparities in healthcare, racial disparities in education, in suspensions, in the criminal justice system. I can go through everything. And so this to me is an issue of trust. Because these issues are not right or left. They're right or wrong. And the Democratic Party's hands are not clean. I've sat where you sat for so many presidential elections, living in an inner city, looking at people who we're electing who are often part of the problem. Now, so this to me is an issue of trust. dealing with racial disparities, we need to make sure that the next president, this isn't going to be a secondary issue, but that we understand that this is a real issue of trust. Now look, again, what have you been doing? I got to the United States Senate as the 4th ever elected African American in the Senate's history, popularly elected African American. And when I got there, don't applaud me, applaud my ancestors. People who fought for them. My mom said that you got there by the blood, sweat, and tears of those who came before you. And the key is not to be number 1, 2, 3, or 4. The key is to make sure you're not the last. This is why South Carolina, please, please, please elect Jamie Harrison as the next senator. And so, but let me tell you, it is not just enough to have a black senator. I got there and I looked at the staffs. It was the least diverse place I had ever worked before in my life. And I looked at the Judiciary Committee staff because I wanted to get on that committee, and I didn't see one African-American staffer. You talk about Hamilton being in the room when it happened. This was a committee making decisions about African-American lives and African-American bodies, and there wasn't even an African-American in the room. And so what did I do? I went to Chuck Schumer, got a great young senator from Hawaii, Brian Schatz, and we just said, this is outrageous, because most of the Democratic senators, guess how they get elected? With audiences that look a lot like this. African-American communities. And so what we did is we said, I only know one way of doing things, is accountability, which is having standards, measures, and consequences when things don't happen. And so we asked Chuck Schumer, and he gladly did it, to have every Democratic senator publish your diversity statistics. How many women and minorities do you have in positions of power? And guess what's happened since we've done that? The number of African Americans hired in the Senate has gone up. And so when you ask me about this is why I get angry. Before I even get to that, let me just go with marijuana. This has been killing black communities. There's more marijuana arrests in 2017 than all the violent crime arrests in the country combined. And they're not arresting everybody. People on college campuses, Stanford, I used to see people smoking pot all the time. No worries, it is disproportionately people of color. So now everybody's moving to legalize marijuana. This is a big business. Hundreds of billions of dollars are gonna be made in the business. And yet people, when they talk about legalization, they don't go the next 2 or 3 steps. The first step should be, don't talk to me about legalizing marijuana. I have the lead bill in the Senate to do it, but my bill is called the Marijuana Justice Act. You've got to also talk about expunging the records of all of those people. But let's not stop there. Let's not stop there. Now you want to make sure that in the communities that have been devastated by marijuana enforcement, that people from those communities actually get a chance to have the licenses to sell marijuana legally. And that's not happening right now. We're about to shift into legalization of marijuana in state after state after state, and the people there the people selling it are disproportionately lacking the diversity that our nation does. And so to your point about the jobs of the future, I want to be clear. I had to have some very stern conversations with unions when I was a mayor of my town. We were building the first new hotel in 40 years. I had to go to my unions and say, I know that you have systems of who gets on jobs when, but I'm sorry, this is being built in an African American community, and there needs to be African Americans, more diversity in this union. And there needs to be apprenticeship programs for my kids. And so I think Mustafa's 100% right. There is going to be a new energy job boom in this country, and we've got to make sure that those opportunities, because a lot of people want to talk to you about the wealth gap, the wealth gap, the wealth gap. Look, there are a lot of people in my community that want to be entrepreneurs. They want to be millionaires. And so I always talk about the wealth gap. Yeah, what we really need to be talking about is the opportunity gap. And to make sure that everybody has equal opportunity to start a business, to be innovators, to participate in the new job booms of the future and the new businesses of the future. And this comes back to how I started, which is trust. If I am your president, a person who has spent my career working on these issues, I am going to make sure that these issues of racial equity are not on the side, that you will have a president in me, someone who understands these issues intimately and makes sure that I'm working every single day so that this nation is who it says it is, a nation of liberty, justice, and opportunity for all.
Senator Booker, Flint, Michigan brought environmental justice to the national stage with the water crisis. Now, 5 years into that, people in Flint still don't have clean water. And this year, people in your own community, your neighbors in Newark, New Jersey, where you once served as mayor and still represent them as senator, are also facing a crisis of lead contamination in the drinking water. Flint and Newark aren't alone. Thousands of water system towns, villages, and cities around the country are facing contamination right here in South Carolina. What specifically are you doing to address this national crisis, and what are you doing in Newark, your own community, with people in the throes of this water crisis?
So look, leaders take responsibility and get things done. And so when this crisis broke out in my city, I went right across the aisle in the Senate, where I've worked to build relationships, and passed a major piece of legislation. These are the kind of things people don't want to talk about, actually getting things done in Washington. That was allowed states to shift resources, literally hundreds of millions, I think, in total, into funds that can get these lead pipes out of the water. This, to me, as you said it, this is my family, this is my community. And my community isn't alone. There are thousands of jurisdictions, as I said right now, where children have more than twice the blood lead levels of Flint, Michigan. And so I'm taking action now as a United States Senator. But if I'm President of the United States, enough. Lead service lines should not be in the ground in a 21st century America, period. And I will make sure that we have a fund to get every single lead service line out of the ground in cities all across America. But we can't stop there. We have, this is a true story, because I'm telling you, I'm admitting my inadequacies, because I got to the United States Senate as being the New Jersey senator. This is one of the things that led me on my environmental justice tour. And I was also on the Africa subcommittee as a foreign relations person. So I had this doctor, Dr. Peter Hotaz, who came in to see me because I wanted to talk to him about neglected tropical diseases in African countries. And I'm flipping through his book as we're talking about things I could do as a United States senator for the continent. And I'm flipping through books and seeing these maps of where the neglected tropical diseases are, and I almost fell out of my seat when I saw them in some states in the United States of America. And I said, I didn't know we had things like hookworm and the like. And he goes, absolutely, in communities that are 100 to 200% of the poverty line, the doctors don't even think they exist in North America. And I literally said, I have to go see this with my own eyes. And so I found myself in places in Alabama, in like Lowndes County, Alabama, where I stood there and saw communities that they can't have septic because the soil won't allow it, and they have just straight pipes coming out of the back of people's homes. I sat with families who talked to me about when it rains, about having all of that stuff back up into their home. And so when you start seeing what I've seen in this country, this is a reflective of an impotency of empathy. That we could live in a nation where we don't see what communities are suffering, who do not have access to clean water, who do not have access to proper sewage, who in America, it should be a right of every citizen to have clean air, clean water, and clean soil. And so I have in my climate plan, I'm one of the few people that has major pillars on environmental justice. And one of the things we're going to do is make sure we have a community where everyone has access to clean air and clean water, but it also means taking on sacred cows. And when I'm saying sacred cows, I'm almost literally talking about it because the corporate industrial animal agriculture industry, we must begin to talk about what it's doing to our country. When I talked earlier about Duplin County, North Carolina, one of the reasons why groundwater is being contaminated is because you don't have the heritage of our country, which is the way we used to raise pigs and farms. Now we have multinational corporations like Smithfield, who have these contract farmers who live like sharecroppers. We should have empathy for them too, because they find themselves in these contracts where they're constantly living in massive debt. You see these massive things called CAFOs, concentrated animal feeding operations, that are all covered, and pigs produce 10 times the feces than human beings do. I sat and watched it going into these massive lagoons. In Duplin County, it's historically black communities. And I stood there with activists as I watched this spray field spray the literal shit out onto the fields. And then I watched it waft into you know, when you spray your lawn, some of it mists off the property and into black communities. I sat in packed rooms with African Americans who told me about respiratory diseases, cancers, what it feels like not to be able to open your windows in your home, run your air conditioning. You can't put your clothing on the lines. This is happening from Iowa to North Carolina, and we are not conscious of this crisis in our country. I met with a Republican farmer in the Midwest. Still remember, Western Illinois, who told me when the CAFOs came around his farm, he could no longer fish in his creek, no longer drink his well water. And so I'm just fed up. It's very hard for me to sit comfortably in Newark, even with our lead water crisis, and know that there are Americans who are facing diseases, cancers, who've lost the value of their land that they've been on since slavery. And we are doing nothing as a society about it. That is so against our country. And so as President of the United States, I have in my plan funds to do something about it. And I'm going to make sure as your president, I fight and become the president that champions environmental justice in a way like you've never seen before.
All right. Senator Booker, we're going to now go to one of our students.
Okay.
Desmond Williams, can you please come to the podium?
I saw the last student who came up here play ball. He played my position, tight end.
I saw that.
In my mind, I could still run a faster 40 than he can.
Well, the mind is an interesting place to be.
Yeah.
Desmond, why don't you go ahead and handle that?
Desmond, how are you, man?
I'm great.
Man, what's it like to have beautiful hair? You got those rolls of waves in your hair, man. I used to have pretty hair too, man. This is your future right here. I'm not talking about his hair. He's going to be a future presidential candidate. Go ahead, Desmond.
Well, my name is Desmond Williams. I'm a junior industrial engineer here at SCSU. SCSU, that's that.
Yeah, yes.
But recently you have stated that clean air and clean water shouldn't be luxuries for the privileged. Yet every day, communities of color, low-income communities, and indigenous communities disproportionately face environmental hazards and harmful pollutants. So I was wondering if you could elaborate on the statement.
I mean, it shouldn't, we were just talking about this, it shouldn't be, no, stay there, Desmond. Let me look at you, man. Don't get off that stage. I know you're nervous and your hair and everything. Don't worry about it. Just don't do what Mustafa did. That's an affront. That amount of hair is just so, it's just like, he's trying to make me feel inadequate. That's what he's trying to do. So look, man, this is the United States of America, and clean air, clean water should not be the purview of the wealthy or the privileged. It should be an American right for everybody. But nothing happens automatically. We got to fight for it. And this is the thing that's stopping this from being an issue. The only people that are fighting for it are the people that are directly affected by it. We're never going to solve this problem. We've got to have a more courageous empathy that I learned from my parents. A leader of their generation used to always say that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so that's what I'm calling on you, because one thing I've learned is, and as much as I'm running for President of the United States because I know the things I can do from that office, I want to tell you right now, that historically change does not come from Washington. It comes to Washington. We didn't get women's suffrage because in 1920 a bunch of guys got together on the Senate floor and said, "Hey fellas, let's give women the right to vote." No, that's not how it happened. We didn't get civil rights because one day Strom Thurmond changed his mind and came to the Senate floor and said, "I seen the light, let those Negro people have some rights." No, it happened because people fought for it. And so my point is power concedes nothing, as Frederick Douglass says, without a demand. There is no progress without struggle. And so my challenge to you and my warning to you as your president is, I'm warning you right now, if you elect me your president, I'm going to ask more from you than any president's ever asked from you and everybody else in their lifetime. Because we are not going to change these things just by removing one guy from office and putting another guy in, even though I got a much better haircut than him. We are going to change things when we mobilize this country in the way we mobilized in other movements to change this nation's destiny. Everything we've done has not been done with partisan majorities swinging one way or the other. It's done with new American majorities who are demanding the change that needs to be made. And so right now, I'm sorry, the inertia against climate change, the corporate interests, the powerful, the way we're going to deal with the climate crisis is to mobilize this country actively like we haven't seen before. But the same thing goes with child poverty, which is violence against children in this country that's going along with poverty. The same thing goes with gun violence. The majority of murders in this country are men like you. Young black men are the majority of homicides. All of these things are going to necessitate a level of activism. So you're going to have an activist president, but I'm going to need your help too. My question back to you, because you don't get to ask me one without me asking you one, is are you willing to fight and work and struggle with me and others?
I am.
All right, all right.
Senator Booker, if you could talk about your personal decision to be a vegan, which really brings together the issue of the environment and personal health.
Would I talk about, I'm sorry, I didn't hear the beginning.
Your personal decision to be a vegan.
Listen, my personal decision is to try every day to be a better living the values in which I hold. And so my veganism is a much better way to accord myself with my values. But I want to be clear with you that, because I don't want this to be a holier than thou moment, I don't know where the suit I'm wearing was made. And fast fashion is injustice. It is injustice. You know, these are vegan shoes, so I'm trying to be consistent with things. So for me, all of us have to do a better job in living in accordance with what our values are. I don't want to preach to people what our values are, but I know what corporate animal agriculture, not the farm heritage, independent family farmers I've met all around this country, but massive corporate animal agriculture is destroying the environment. What's happening to animals is something of America. In fact, they're passing these things called ag-gag laws, which I know you've heard of, where they're trying to block Americans from actually knowing what's happening to animals. That's why those CAFOs are usually covered so you can't see in the misery and the suffering going on with animals. And so for me, from everything from my health, the leading cause of death for black men is preventable diseases. As Ron Finley, he's a TED Talk, black man in South Central Los Angeles, he has this great TED Talk, you should watch it, where he says in South Central we got drive-bys and drive-throughs. And the drive-throughs are killing more people than the drive-bys. And so I'm trying to do my best to live my values. I fail every day, but I want to get better and better and better, to be more conscious about the decisions I'm making. And in a capitalist society, you vote every day with your dollars. And so my veganism is something I'm happy to talk about and about the reasons why. But I want to tell you this. Martin Luther King said it more eloquently than I could ever say it. He goes, I can't pass laws to make you love me, but I can pass laws to stop you from lynching me. I can't pass laws to change your heart, but I can pass laws to restrain the heartless. And so I may not want to force my dietary habits on everybody here, but if I'm your president, I'm going to stop us subsidizing through our ag bills the corporate animal agriculture that ultimately is hurting our country. And I haven't heard another presidential candidate that wants to talk about these issues. Animal agriculture right now is the way the large corporate animal agriculture is driving so much of the problems with climate change. The number one reason for deforestation, rainforest deforestation, is grazing lands for the larger and larger consumption of meat. Scientists say that we would need 4 planet Earths if the rest of the planet ate the standard American diet. And by the way, China is moving towards the standard American diet. More people are eating like we're eating. And so we have to start talking about a free market, not the subsidization of corporations, whether it's oil companies or folks that are doing it. Now, if I have more sway over the ag bill, God, we're going to let farmers lead us out of this, but we're going to be doing things like incentivizing cover crops and no-till farming, things that pull carbon out of the air. We're going to incentivize reforestation. I have a plan to plant 100 million trees in urban areas, which will cool them down, pull more carbon out of the air. We need to start using our incentives, our taxpayer dollars, to incentivize the right behavior and stop the human suffering that's going on as a result of a lot of the things we're doing, subsidizing with our taxpayer dollars.
Senator Booker, thank you for your time.
Mustafa. Hold on. Thank you. Thank you. I just want to say one more time. First of all, I watch Amy on TV. Every time I see her, I get a little starstruck here because she's an incredible voice of truth-telling. She's fair, straight shooter, and she exposes a lot of the ignorance in art. So I want to thank you for what you do every day, for being one of those journalists that speaks truth to power. And I just want to say Mustafa is one of my heroes. He's an unsung hero. He's a low-key guy. and he blew up my text messages. I think you were sending me one every week about you better be here, and that's when I knew it was for real, and we changed our schedule so I can be here. But my point is to you all, do not think that just because we have a Democrat elected, it's going to solve all of our problems. We have not seen that happen before. Please support the candidate you feel an authentic connection to, but then hold them accountable. Hold them accountable. We have to have a new era of activism in our country, or if not, we are going to decline as a nation. And already our life expectancy is going down. Already the black-white wealth gap is growing again in this country. We have a lot of indices that portend of a decline, but I will not let that happen. We cannot let that happen. If we stand together, work together, sacrifice together, struggle together, like our ancestors have, we will not decline. We will rise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Cory Booker here at the first ever Presidential Forum on Environmental Justice. This is our